because Judge Jackson lets them off so easy. In one case, Judge Jackson gave child pornographer Wesley Hawkins just 3 months in prison when the sentencing guidelines recommended 8 to 10 years. 3 months versus a recommended 8 to 10 years. Judge Jackson even gave him a sentence that was 1/6 as long as what her own probation office recommended. And a few years later, when Hawkins should have still been in prison for his original offense, he did something else. They got him 6 more months in custody. That's twice as long as his original sentence. When all 11 Republicans on the Judiciary Committee sent a letter asking for details of what happened to justify this new sentence, Judge Jackson refused to provide any further information. So much, I guess, for looking at her record, as she urged us to do. Her leniency isn't limited to child pornographers either. In 2017, Judge Jackson apologized. She apologized to a fentanyl kingpin, his own words, kingpin, because she couldn't find a way to sidestep the law to give him less than the mandatory minimum sentence. She was very sorry that she had to give him such a long sentence. But I guess where there's a will, there's a way. A few years ago, she found a way to re-sentence this self-described kingpin below the mandatory minimum sentence. Through a completely made-up reinterpretation, Judge Jackson made the First Step Act retroactive for this fentanyl kingpin, something Congress had explicitly tried to avoid when it passed the law. This was judicial activism, plain and simple. In her testimony, Judge Jackson claimed that there were no victims in that case. She's wrong. Fentanyl trafficking is not a victimless crime, and anyone who doesn't understand that doesn't belong on the Supreme Court. In another case, Judge Jackson granted compassionate release to a man who brutally murdered a deputy U.S. Marshal on the steps of a church at a funeral. While in prison, this cop killer threatened prison staff and was caught in possession of a dangerous weapon, not exactly a model inmate. He was repeatedly denied parole. Yet Judge Jackson granted him compassionate release because he had high blood pressure. In yet another case, a career criminal assaulted a deputy U.S. Marshal with a deadly weapon while resisting arrest. This was the 3rd time that this criminal had assaulted law enforcement officers, the very officers who risked their life to keep judges like Judge Jackson safe. Judge Jackson didn't just sentence him below the government's request or the sentencing guideline range. She gave the criminal less time than even the criminal himself had advocated. You can't make this stuff up. In 2013, a sex offender who had repeatedly raped his 13-year-old niece was arrested for falsifying sex offender registration records to avoid telling the government where he was living and that he was working at a daycare. The government sought a 2-year prison sentence, but Judge Jackson gave him just 1 year instead. And during that 2nd year, when he would have been in prison, he tried to rape again and then bribed the victim with $2,500 to recant her testimony. This dangerous sex offender was convicted of obstructing justice, yet when presented with a do-over, Judge Jackson sentenced him to just 24 months in prison for those violations. Now, I wish I could say this was to her credit because, to be fair, 24 months was the sentence recommended by the government, but she ensured her order in that sentence would run concurrently with the sentence in local D.C. jail, so he'd only end up serving 1 year instead of 2. Judge Jackson habitually sympathizes with criminals over victims. These are just a few of the many outrageous cases in Judge Jackson's record. The takeaway is crystal clear. If you're a criminal, you'd be lucky to have your case assigned to Judge Jackson. If you're a victim or anyone else seeking justice, you should hope that your case is assigned to literally any other judge. As a trial judge, though, Judge Jackson could only help one criminal at a time. As a Supreme Court justice, she would be able to benefit criminals nationwide in all cases. Judge Jackson's far-left activism extends beyond crime as well. Not only did she engage in what the Sixth Circuit called an end run around Congress to retroactively reduce the sentence of that fentanyl kingpin I mentioned earlier, she also worked to strike down a Trump administration order expediting the removal of illegal aliens on equally specious legal grounds. The law passed by Congress granted the Department of Homeland Security, quote, sole and unreviewable discretion to decide which illegal alien should be subject to expedited removal. Nonetheless, Judge Jackson inserted herself to strike down what she called, quote, a terrible policy by the Department of Homeland Security. Well, I regret to inform Judge Jackson it is not her role in our system to decide whether immigration policy is good, bad, terrible, or any other adjective she wants to use, only whether it is lawful and authorized by law. And of course, the D.C. Circuit Court, which is not exactly a hotbed of conservative jurists, agreed and reversed Judge Jackson's decision, noting that there are, quote, could hardly be a more definitive expression of congressional intent than the language in that law that she disregarded. But Judge Jackson didn't care. She had an anti-Trump op-ed that she wanted to write in the form of a judicial opinion. Judge Jackson has also shown real interest in helping terrorists. Now, it's true that you shouldn't judge a lawyer for being willing to take on an unpopular case, but you can certainly learn something about a lawyer from the cases they seek out. And for Judge Jackson and her friends in the liberal legal profession, these cases were not unpopular at all. Judge Jackson represented 4 terrorists as a public defender, one of whom she continued to represent in private practice, voluntarily. And she voluntarily filed multiple friend of the court briefs on behalf of terrorists while in private practice. To make matters worse, she apparently didn't even bother when she was representing these terrorists. She didn't bother to establish a reasonable belief that what she filed with the court was factually true. 3 of her 4 case filings were identical, word for word, comma for comma. She alleged identical facts and legal arguments in each case. The only differences between the briefs were the names and the case numbers. In every one of those cases, she claimed the terrorist had never had any affiliation with the Taliban or al-Qaeda. And in every one of those cases, she accused the Bush administration and American soldiers of war crimes. And who were these supposed innocent victims of American war crimes who, according to Judge Jackson, had nothing at all to do with terrorism? No sirree, nothing at all. Well, one of her clients designed the prototype shoe bomb that was used in an unsuccessful attempt to blow up a passenger airplane. Another planned and executed a rocket attack on U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And a third was arrested in a raid on an al-Qaeda explosives training camp. Yet in every case, she claimed that none of them had anything to do with terrorism. Not a thing. Totally innocent, just goat herders who were picked up by marauding American troops. You know, the last Judge Jackson left the Supreme Court to go to Nuremberg and prosecute the case against the Nazis. This Judge Jackson might have gone there to defend them. Judge Jackson also refused to answer one common sense question after another. For example, when Senator Blackburn asked her what a woman is, she pretended not to know. I asked her who has more of a right to be in the United States, new citizens who followed the rules or illegal aliens whose very first act in the United States was to break our laws. Judge Jackson refused to answer. And when I asked a simple question of Judge Jackson whether releasing Guantanamo Bay terrorists would make us more safe or less safe, she again pretended not to know the answer, even though it's published by the Biden administration. I also asked Judge Jackson if criminals were more or less likely to commit a crime if they knew that they would be caught, convicted, and sentenced. I asked this pretty basic question at least 3 times. It was not a hard question, and yet again, she refused to answer. Judge Jackson also refused to say whether packing the Supreme Court was a bad idea, even though the judge for whom she clerked and seeks to replace Justice Breyer and the late sainted Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, neither of whom are known for their conservative views, were both willing to publicly denounce such court-packing schemes by the Democrats. Judge Jackson may feign ignorance, not because she doesn't know these answers, but because liberal judicial philosophy is all too often based on denying reality. As a judge, Judge Jackson has denied that reality again and again. Judge Jackson will coddle criminals and terrorists, and she will twist or ignore the law to reach the result that she wants. That's not what we need in a Supreme Court justice, and that's why I will be voting against her nomination. Madam President, yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, if a budget is a set of priorities, here are the President's: an expanded federal government, a diminished national defense, higher gas prices, and an open border. Those are the priorities reflected in the budget the President released last week, which contains pretty much what you would expect: more taxes, more spending, more borrowing, and in all likelihood, more inflation as a result. Madam President, big taxes and big spending have been the agenda for President Biden since he took office. After signing a $1.9 trillion spending spree in March of 2021 that helped create the worst inflation in 40 years, President Biden spent much of last year pushing for still more spending to fund his vision of an expanded federal government. And his 2023 budget is just more of the same. The President's budget would increase average yearly spending by 66% as compared to the average of the last 10 years. 66%. That is a staggering spending increase. Yearly federal spending under the Biden budget would average $7.3 trillion. Now, to put that in perspective, Madam President, total average spending in 2019 was $4.4 trillion. Now, how is the President going to pay for this, if he even can? Taxes. A lot of taxes. The biggest tax increase in history in dollar terms, according to Bloomberg. The President, of course, attempts to sell the tax hikes he's proposing as something that won't affect ordinary Americans. Well, that couldn't be more wrong. That corporate tax hike that he keeps pushing, one study estimates that 31% of the corporate tax is borne by consumers. Another big portion of it is borne by labor, otherwise known as ordinary, hardworking Americans. High prices, fewer jobs, lower salaries. We can expect to see all that and more if the President hikes taxes on companies. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that a corporate tax hike may end up hurting private pensions and the value of Americans' 401ks. Then there are the tax hikes on conventional energy companies, the companies that produce the oil and gas that Americans use to heat their homes and to drive their cars. Increasing taxes on fossil fuel companies to the tune of tens of billions of dollars is pretty much guaranteed to discourage the additional energy production we need to drive down gas prices. Ironically, the proposals to go after traditional American energy production come from the same administration that is releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to deal with high gas prices. You can't make this up. Oh, and then there's inflation. Democrats helped create our current inflation crisis by sending a lot of unnecessary government money into the economy via the so-called American Rescue Plan. The president's budget would essentially do the same thing, which means our already serious inflation crisis could get even worse. Madam President, I mentioned the big spending increases in the president's budget. But what I actually meant are the big non-defense spending increases. Because while on paper it may look like the president is hiking defense spending, his supposed funding increase would be effectively canceled out by inflation. When you take into account Democrats' historic inflation, it turns out that President Biden's supposed defense spending increase could actually turn out to be a spending cut. Even in the best case scenario, his budget would leave defense spending essentially flat, which would leave our military dangerously underfunded. And that, Madam President, is a big problem. In a rapidly evolving threat environment, the last thing we can afford is a self-inflicted defeat from underfunding our military. Given Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and threats to NATO and increasingly aggressive China, Iran's nuclear ambitions, North Korea's uptick in missile tests, and the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan, among other things, President Biden should be taking national defense spending at least as seriously as domestic spending. But he's not. The Biden budget proposal would leave the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Space Force under-equipped and undermanned, and put our defense planning on a dangerously insufficient trajectory. The President's budget also fails to adequately address border security and immigration enforcement. Almost since the day the President took office, we've been experiencing an unprecedented flood of illegal immigration across our southern border. In fiscal year 2021, the Border Patrol encountered more than 1.7 million individuals attempting to cross our southern border, the highest number ever recorded. We've had 12 straight months of border encounters in excess of 150,000. And the surge is likely to get even worse now that the President has rescinded the Title 42 border policy to immediately deport individuals illegally attempting to cross the border. And what is the President's answer? Well, a $150 million cut to the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement for next year. That's right. We're experiencing an unprecedented surge of illegal immigration, and the President's budget would cut funding to immigration and customs enforcement. Madam President, perhaps the most outrageous thing about the President's budget is the way he misrepresents it. He's now trying to portray himself as somewhat fiscally responsible, as if a 66% higher yearly average spending than the last 10 years could be considered fiscally responsible. The President's talking a lot about deficit reduction, both the deficit reduction he has supposedly created and the deficit reduction his budget will supposedly produce. But the actual numbers, well, again, they tell a very different story. The deficit reduction the President would like to take credit for is partly the result of the end of temporary COVID spending measures, which were scheduled to end whether the President lifted a finger or not. And our current deficit would have been a lot lower if the President hadn't decided that we needed a partisan $1.9 trillion spending spree last year, a spending spree entirely made up of deficit spending. When it comes to the President's 2023 budget, the administration claims, and I quote, "Deficits under the budget policies would fall to less than 1/3 of the 2020 level the President inherited," end quote. Well, the key phrase there, Madam President, is the 2020 level the President inherited. 2020 saw a huge but temporary surge in government spending to deal with the onset of the COVID crisis. As a result, it is grossly deceptive to take the 2020 deficit as a baseline. A more honest assessment of the prospects for deficit reduction under the President's budget would look at pre-COVID deficits as a baseline and compare the President's future deficits to those. But that wouldn't suit the President's purposes. Now that it's become apparent that the American people are not in fact thrilled by far-left Democrat governance, the President is eager to portray himself as a moderate, hence his inflated claims of deficit reduction. It's the same reason the President is touting his supposed spending hike on national defense while conveniently omitting the fact that when you figure in real inflation, the spending hike may actually be a spending cut. Madam President, no matter how the President tries to dress it up, his fiscal year 2023 budget is more of the same far-left priorities. More taxes, more unnecessary spending, and more economic pain for the American people. And I hope, Madam President, I hope my Democrat colleagues will think twice before foisting this budget onto hardworking Americans. Madam President, I yield the floor. I suggest a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
I would ask unanimous consent for the quorum call to be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I have 8 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Madam President, I rise to speak in support of the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to serve as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. When confirmed, Judge Jackson, who currently serves on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, will take the seat on the Supreme Court that Justice Stephen Breyer has held for almost 3 decades. So I'd like to first offer a few words about Justice Breyer as he prepares to step down from the bench. Justice Breyer has served the court and the nation with grace, expertise, humility, brilliance, and an unwavering dedication to justice. He has worked tirelessly to build consensus among his colleagues, and he has always kept in mind the real-world impacts of the court's decisions on the American people. Justice Breyer knew that justice for some was a failure of the court. From his opinions on voting rights to reproductive rights to the Affordable Care Act, he has been a key voice in many historic decisions that have affected so many Americans. We owe him a great debt of gratitude. And I'm honored and privileged to call Justice Breyer a dear friend, and I wish him the best in his retirement. Now, in looking for Justice Breyer's successor, President Biden said that he wanted to nominate a persuasive justice, someone in the mold of Justice Breyer. And with Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, President Biden has found that person. I am confident that Judge Jackson, who clerked for Justice Breyer on the Supreme Court, will follow in his footsteps as a justice who will make a lasting contribution on the court through her pragmatism, even-handedness, and deep understanding of the Constitution and the impact that the court's decisions have on all Americans. And as the first African-American woman justice on the bench, Judge Jackson's historic nomination is an important and long overdue step towards making the Supreme Court better reflect the nation whose people the court serves. 54 years ago yesterday, our nation, our world, lost the guiding light of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to assassination. That loss was incalculable. We can only imagine the society we would live in if Dr. King were still with us, preaching, marching, teaching. And I have no doubt that Dr. King would be on the steps of the Capitol as the loudest and proudest voice in support of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be our next Supreme Court justice and the first black woman to serve on our highest court. He would know that with the appointment and confirmation of Judge Jackson, we would take the long overdue step to make the nation's top court look more like and better represent all of the American people. The legacy of the more just, more equal society that Dr. King pushed us to create is alive, and it's well in this confirmation and on the floor and hearing rooms of the United States Senate this week. The Judiciary Committee held 4 days of hearings on Judge Jackson's nomination, including 2 days of testimony from the judge herself. As we all saw, some of the questioning of Judge Jackson from some of my Republican colleagues was nothing short of offensive, distorting her record and tinged with racism and sexism. But Judge Jackson responded with poise. She responded with brilliance. She calmly addressed and corrected her questioner's false and misleading premises. And she did so while demonstrating deep knowledge of the law and the Constitution, respect for precedent, and displaying precisely the kind of temperament we expect of someone sitting on the nation's highest court. The hearings showed the nation that Judge Jackson possesses all of the essential qualities of a jurist committed to the words engraved above the entrance to the Supreme Court itself: equal justice under law. Of course, to anyone who knew Judge Jackson before her introduction to the nation as a Supreme Court nominee, none of this was surprising. Judge Jackson's qualifications to serve on the Supreme Court are second to none. She holds broad experience across the legal profession as a Supreme Court clerk, as a federal public defender, and as an attorney in private practice, and as a member of the United States Sentencing Commission, as a federal district court judge, and as a federal appellate judge. It was therefore surprising to no one that she earned a unanimous, well-qualified rating from the American Bar Association. Let me speak for a moment about one aspect of Judge Jackson's background that stands out. and that is her experience as a public defender. When confirmed, Judge Jackson will become the first ever justice with background as a public defender, and the first justice with significant criminal defense experience since the service of Justice Thurgood Marshall, who retired in 1991. That work as a federal public defender has unjustly come under attack from my colleagues across the aisle, who suggest that being a public defender means that she is soft on crime. But my Republican colleagues, who far too often focus singularly on the constitutional right to bear arms, would do well to remember that among the Constitution's other enshrined rights is the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel in criminal cases. Without that right, criminal defendants who cannot afford an attorney would find it difficult or impossible to navigate the court system with their rights protected, including the fundamental right to a speedy and fair trial. My Republican friends may also want to consider that Judge Jackson comes from a law enforcement family with a brother and uncles serving as police officers, and that she has won the endorsement of the Fraternal Order of Police, the nation's largest police union. And let me remind my colleagues that public defenders do not select their clients. They take on every assigned case because they are committed to preserving and defending constitutional rights for everyone. As a federal public defender, Judge Jackson represented the most vulnerable among us. She represented the clients other lawyers avoided. And in doing so, she followed a long and honorable tradition in the American legal profession that began with John Adams, stepping forward in 1770 to represent the British soldiers who committed the Boston Massacre, because he feared that they would not receive a fair trial without adequate representation. By confirming Judge Jackson, we will affirm that the rights of those who cannot afford a lawyer are just as important as the rights of those who can pay lawyers charging $1,000 an hour. That the rights of the indigent and powerless are just as important as those of the rich and the powerful. Public defenders also experience firsthand and therefore understand better than other lawyers just how our justice system treats the accused, how it treats people of color, how it treats low-income people. Every day, public defenders see the systemic biases and prejudices that permeate our criminal justice system. At a time when the United States holds more people behind bars than any other nation on earth, including authoritarian regimes like North Korea and China, the highest court in the land would greatly benefit from a justice with a public defender background. Public defenders serve as a unique bulwark of liberty and racial justice. So we should welcome a public defender on the Supreme Court, especially one as well qualified as Judge Jackson. Her singular perspective and voice are sorely needed. Judge Jackson's service as a trial judge on the United States District Court for the District of Columbia is also of particular note in this nomination. Only one of the current Supreme Court justices, Justice Sotomayor, has ever served on a trial court. And as a trial court judge, Judge Jackson worked to ensure that the parties before her understood her approach to deciding cases. Judge Jackson has explained that as a trial judge, she emphasized speaking directly to the individuals who appeared before her, not just to their lawyers. She used the parties' names and treated them with respect. She sought to ensure that those whom her rulings would directly impact clearly understood the proceedings in which they were involved, what was happening, and why it was happening. This approach speaks to a judge who understands the importance of accessibility to the law, to a judicial process that isn't shrouded in mystery, and to a system that fulfills its promise of equal justice under the law to everyone. We will be fortunate to have such a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. I have had the opportunity to meet with Judge Jackson one-on-one. I came away deeply impressed and convinced that President Biden has made a great choice. The Senate has already confirmed Judge Jackson 3 times on a bipartisan basis, most recently in June of 2021, when she was confirmed to the D.C. Circuit. The Senate should again confirm her with bipartisan support. And when Judge Jackson is confirmed and becomes Justice Jackson, the first African-American woman ever to take a seat on the High Court, she will be an inspiration to so many across our country and around the globe. She will especially be a role model for young black girls everywhere, showing them that in the United States of America, nothing is beyond their reach. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall once said, "Sometimes history takes things into its own hands." History says it's time for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, and I am honored to help her and the court and our country make history with her confirmation. I urge all of my colleagues to vote to confirm Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Madam President, I yield.
I couldn't even actually say what I was like, and it was coming. I was just like.
Madam President.
Senator from Arkansas.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to recognize the significant legislative victories the Senate recently delivered for women veterans with the passage of 2 pieces of legislation to modernize breast cancer screening policies and the delivery of life-saving care for women veterans. Breast cancer is the second most common cancer for women. For women veterans and service members, the incidence of breast cancer is estimated to be up to 40% higher than the general population. Given the dangerous environments in which military members serve and additional risk factors associated with these locations, it's long overdue for the Department of Veterans Affairs to update its policies for administering mammograms. We know early detection is crucial to preventing and treating breast cancer. So making sure those who are more vulnerable receive screenings at a younger age is not only reasonable, but critical. This would have helped Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas, a Marine veteran, who was unaware of her increased risk for breast cancer. She shared her memories of deployment to Fallujah in 2005 with the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee last year. She understood the risk associated with IEDs, and she remembers the burn pits, so commonplace they were largely ignored. But she wasn't concerned with the impact of what she called, quote, the flaming poison, end quote, surrounding her would have on her own health. In a routine medical appointment with her VHA health provider in 2018, Kate thought it was odd she was recommended to undergo a mammogram. That exam subsequently led to her diagnosis of stage 4 breast cancer. She was 38 years old. That's devastating news for anyone to face, and I know the entire Senate joins me in praying for Kate as she continues her fight against cancer. Nobody would blame her for focusing on her own health battle, but she knows her story wouldn't be the last if something didn't change. That's why Kate has been an advocate for modernizing VA policies so other veterans don't experience the same struggles she's living with. We honored her activism by crafting and passing the Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas Supporting Expanded Review for Veterans in Combat Environments Act. It will broaden veteran access to mammograms and also require the VA to compile data regarding the rates of breast cancer among members of the veteran and civilian population so we can continue improving procedures to better treat breast cancer patients. The Senate also unanimously passed the Mammo for Veterans Act to expand access to high-quality breast cancer screenings, improving imaging services in rural areas, and clinical trials through partnerships with the National Cancer Institute. The VA is uniquely positioned to be a leader in the prevention and treatment of breast cancer, taking full advantage of the department's unique capabilities, resources, and outreach will help deliver the life-saving care that veterans deserve. Passage of the Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas Service Act and the Mammo for Veterans Act reflects the bipartisan support for improving veteran services and benefits. I appreciate Senator Wyden's support and leadership of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee and the leadership of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee Chairman Tester, who's been my reliable partner in advancing policies to improve the VA's care and services for women. The VA estimates women make up 10% of our nation's veteran population and continues to be the fastest growing population. Last Congress, we made significant progress to expand VA's care and services for women with the passage of the landmark Deborah Sampson Act. This was an important first step, and the legislation we passed last month continues to build on this foundation so we can fulfill the promise made to women who served in our nation's uniform. I'm pleased the Senate has approved these policies, and I urge my colleagues in the House of Representatives to follow our example and quickly approve the Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas Service Act and the Mammo for Veterans Act so that they can be signed into law. The women who have served our country in uniform need to know we're taking every step available to protect their health. These bills are an important down payment in that mission. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield the floor.
Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I've come to the floor today to mourn the passing and celebrate the life of Thomas Horace Porter, my good friend and a man who could put a smile on my face even in the toughest times on one of the most painful days of my life while I was recovering at Walter Reed. Among the peer visitors at Walter Reed Hospital, two of the most beloved were Tom and his wife Eleanor. Tom was a gentle giant, a tall, smiling, then 74-year-old veteran who showed up at my bedside while I was still sedated to talk with my husband and mother, and who came to visit again soon after I regained consciousness. As a young Army lieutenant in the Korean War, Tom had lost both his legs in a landmine explosion. His heroic actions saving his men on that day earned Tom both the Silver Star in addition to the Purple Heart from his combat injuries. During his months of recuperation back in the States, Eleanor, or Elle, as we all know her, an Army second lieutenant herself, had been one of his physical therapists. The couple ended up married for more than 50 years. Tom continued to serve our nation, this time as a civil servant, achieving the rank of Senior Executive Service in the Department of Agriculture. When Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom began and the wounded began flooding the wards at Walter Reed, Tom and Elle decided that they needed to help. They became peer visitors, and for the next 7 years, during twice-weekly visits, they changed the lives of countless veterans who passed through that hospital, my own included. When I was at Walter Reed, Tom made it his mission to talk with injured troops about the full lives they will lead after their devastating injuries. A lot of the wounded warriors around me were really young, just 19 to 24 years old, lying in their hospital beds with limbs missing, burns to their faces and bodies, skulls crushed and encased in protective metal cages or helmets. They were all facing a future none of them had planned for. Like them, I had always assumed I would either die in combat or come home. The third option of coming home severely injured was never something that occurred to the majority of us. Tom would walk in with that big smile of his and say, "Hey, I was like you, lost my legs at 22, but I recovered and have had a full and regular life. I courted Elle after I lost my legs, and she and I have been married for 50 years and have wonderful kids and grandkids." He reassured them that they could still have the lives they dreamed of, and his words had weight because he was living proof that that was possible. He'd wink and joke, "Listen, having an amputation is better than having a puppy. Trust me, you won't have any trouble getting the ladies." And then he'd answer any questions they had because he knew they needed to hear from someone who had already journeyed on the road they were about to travel. For years, Tom and Elle came into Walter Reed every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. Elle was known as the cookie lady because she'd bring in dozens of homemade cookies that she collected from folks at her church. For those of us who were in the hospital a long time, Elle knew our favorites. Mine were oatmeal raisin. If I was at physical therapy or in surgery or getting my wounds debrided, when Elle made her rounds, she'd make sure to leave a little bag of cookie by my bedside table. It was a real treat in the midst of the painful early stages of recovery, something to look forward to every week. Tom and Elle and Tom, the two of them became family for all of us. They would bring me and my husband to their lakeside home, feed us home-cooked meals, and let me fall asleep in their hammock overlooking the water, knowing the good that getting out of that fluorescent-lit hospital room would do me. As someone who loved and was desperately missing the ocean, I can't begin to describe how restorative those days by the lake were. There are no words for how right it felt to be drifting off to sleep to the sound of waves hitting the shore, rather than to the beeps and the buzz of the hospital machines that had been my nightly soundtrack for too long. And there's no possible way to express just how grateful I am to Tom and Elle for making that a possibility. For giving me a taste of home right when I felt most like a stranger to myself. For enveloping me in something good and whole right when I felt untethered from what I felt was my life's mission. And for simply being who they were, kind and fierce, as compassionate for the people they loved as they were passionate about the causes that they believed in. They were our advocates, our heroes, our Tom and our Elle. I'm so sorry for your loss, Elle. We miss Tom every single day. Thank you both for all you did for me and what you did for all of us. We miss you desperately. I yield back, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, we are debating the President's nominee to succeed Justice Stephen Breyer, who has served this country admirably and with great distinction. As a law student, I was fortunate to have Justice Breyer as an advisor, and I remain grateful for his guidance, encouragement, and counsel as I began my legal career. I have immense respect and admiration for him as justice, but even more so as a person. When Justice Breyer announced his retirement, I stated my belief that the next justice on the Supreme Court should be someone with Justice Breyer's integrity, independence, and keen intellect, someone with real-world experience who reflects the depth and breadth of the American people. You could not find someone who better fits that description than Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I rise today in wholehearted support of her nomination to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a powerful arbiter of justice in our nation, with few checks on the decisions of the justices once they are on the court. Therefore, a vote on a Supreme Court nominee is one of the most consequential that any senator can cast. The Constitution makes the Senate an active participant, along with the President, in the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution states that nominees to the Supreme Court shall only be confirmed by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. The Senate's role in the confirmation process places an important democratic check on America's judiciary. As a result, this body's consent is both a constitutional requirement and a democratic obligation. It is in upholding our constitutional duties as senators to give the President advice and consent on his nominations that I believe we have one of the greatest opportunities and responsibilities to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. As I have stated before, my test for a nominee is simple and is drawn from the text, the history, and the principles of the Constitution. A nominee's intellectual gifts, experience, judgment, maturity, and temperament are all important, but these alone are not enough. I need to be convinced that a nominee to the United States Supreme Court will live up to both the letter and spirit of the Constitution. The nominee needs to be committed not only to enforcing laws, but also to doing justice. The nominee needs to be able to make the principles of the Constitution come alive: equality before the law, due process, full and equal participation in the civic and social life of America for all Americans, freedom of conscience, individual responsibility, and the expansion of opportunity. The nominee also needs to see the unique role the court plays in helping balance the often conflicting forces in a democracy between individual autonomy and the obligations of community, between the will of the majority and the rights of the minority. A nominee for the Supreme Court needs to be able to look forward to the future, not just backwards. The nominee needs to make the Constitution resonate in a world that is changing with great rapidity. Judge Jackson passes these tests with flying colors. Beyond her unquestioned intellectual gifts, her legal career over the past 2 decades demonstrates that she has the deep fidelity to equality, justice, and the Constitution required to be our next Supreme Court justice. We want justices to be familiar with the federal court system. Judge Jackson is. Indeed, soon after law school, Judge Jackson chose to clerk at 3 levels of the federal courts, gaining valuable insights into the courtroom and learning directly from incredible jurists, including Judge Bruce Sellier of Rhode Island, who was President Reagan's nominee to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, as well as for Justice Breyer himself. We want justices to understand that a guilty verdict involves a hard task of deciding the appropriate punishment. So while many of her law school classmates likely plotted paths to law firm partnerships, she chose instead to serve as assistant special counsel and later commissioner and vice chair at the U.S. Sentencing Commission, working to prevent unjust disparities in sentencing. We want justices to embody the fundamental notion of fairness as the heart of our justice system, that defendants have a right to counsel and must be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And so Judge Jackson chose to serve as a federal public defender. If confirmed, she will bring this valuable real-life perspective to our highest court, where it is very much needed. Over the past 10 years, first as a district judge and then as a circuit judge, Judge Jackson has been even-handed and impartial in her decisions from the bench, without regard to partisanship, personal views, or ideology. Her opinions showcase an admirable commitment not only to fairness but to transparency. She takes the time to ensure that the parties fully understand her rulings and that the record clearly captures her thought process in deciding a case. She does not hide the ball. There are facts, there are arguments, and everyone is invited to read and understand them. Beyond her career choices and accolades, she demonstrated her judgment, maturity, and equanimity during her recent confirmation hearings. In the face of hours of questioning, some of it quite pointed, political and discomforting, she showed incredible patience, resilience, and grace. Her independence, integrity, and deep understanding of the Constitution shine through in her answers. Her cool in that crucible was not only admirable, it was inspiring. Judge Jackson is a trailblazer, not in the least because she is the first black woman and first federal public defender nominated to the Supreme Court. While her individual accomplishments are personal, Judge Jackson's elevation to the United States Supreme Court will bring America closer to the ideals our country aspires to. Her service on the Supreme Court in the years to come will ensure that the justices better reflect the diversity of our great nation and may help restore the people's faith in the fairness of the court and in our justice system. It is with great pleasure that I support her nomination to the highest court in the land and urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor, and I would notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be initiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today to talk about the need for more American energy. On Thursday, President Biden announced that he's going to release even more oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. To me, this is another desperate Hail Mary pass. It's a short-term effort to deal with their midterm election crisis. It's a crisis that's been created by the policies of this administration. Real crisis is the cost of living crisis, and it's a crisis that is punishing American families. Inflation's at a 40-year high. Gas prices recently hit the highest price ever. Why is it happening? It's economics 101. The supply of energy is not keeping up with the demand for energy. We're now producing about 1.3 million barrels of oil per day fewer, less than we were in 2019. Yet for the last 14 months, Joe Biden's been in the White House. He's done absolutely nothing to increase the supply of American energy. Not sold one lease to produce energy on public lands. Not one. President Obama, at this time into his first term, had already held 47 federal lease sales in his first 14 months in office. For Joe Biden, the number is still 0. Now, this just shows that when it comes to energy, Joe Biden is to the far, far left of any previous American president. Joe Biden is already the most anti-American energy president that we've ever had. He refuses to do any of the things that would actually help our country in terms of our energy needs. He won't increase oil production by a single drop. No, he wants to release some from the Strategic Reserve, but not actually produce any more American energy. So what he's essentially doing is burning through our savings account. This is now the third time that President Biden has released energy from the Strategic Reserve. He's on pace to burn through a third of our oil savings in less than 2 years in office. Soon we're going to have the smallest amount in our reserve, the smallest amount in our savings account since 1984. In November, Joe Biden conducted the largest release from the Strategic Reserve in history. He released 50 million barrels. So what was the result? He made a big announcement of it. The Secretary of Energy did as well. The price of gas went down by 2 cents. 2 cents. The White House was so proud of themselves that they actually sent out a press release congratulating themselves. Prices went back up almost immediately. The result was an utter failure. So now Joe Biden said he's going to release 180 million barrels over the next 6 months. It's 1 million barrels a day for the next 180 days. In other words, between now and right before the elections. The Strategic Reserve is meant for emergencies. It's not meant for cynical political cover-up of what the president has done to our American energy policy. Some people call it an election year gimmick. I call it dangerous. Dangerous because we're going to be less prepared for emergencies, we'll be less secure, and as a nation we will be less safe. Now, 180 million barrels sounds like a lot. That's about the amount we use in an average of 9 or 10 days. We use about 20 million barrels a day in the United States. We're currently importing a lot more than that. Even the president admits that it won't have a big impact, but he doesn't know what else to do. On Thursday, he said this would reduce prices by as little, he said, as 10 cents a gallon. We're still over $4 a gallon nationwide in terms of the national average. I expect it's going to remain that high, over $4 a gallon, through the summer. So who do the American people blame for this? Well, poll after poll, they blame Joe Biden, because he's the one that proudly stood there and beat his chest and said, I've killed the Keystone XL pipeline. The day Joe Biden took office, gasoline $2.38 a gallon. America was energy independent for the first time in 70 years. We were energy dominant. We were exporting energy. We were selling it to our friends instead of having to buy it from our enemies. Joe Biden took office, started attacking American energy, and things deteriorated ever since. That's why it's no surprise that energy and gas prices are up 13 out of the last 14 months. By the time Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, the average price of a gallon of gas had gone up from $2.38 a gallon to $3.53 a gallon. So it was already up over $1.15 a gallon in just over that first year in office for President Biden. Today, the average price of a gallon of gas is about $4.18. Prices may actually go higher if Joe Biden gets his way in terms of energy policy. That's because when the president put out his budget, he wants to raise taxes on American energy. The budget that the president has proposed for the next year contains 36 new taxes. 11 of them are directly on American energy. It costs about $45 billion, which of course would be carried on to the people who buy American energy. They'd be paid by working families in the form of higher gas prices, higher oil bills, cost more to heat your home. Even Nancy Pelosi, when she looked at the budget, said, quote, consumers pay for that. On Thursday, Joe Biden asked Congress to charge fees on oil and gas leases that aren't even being used. Now, this is another gimmick. People want to use those leases, but the administration is blocking the permission to drill to use the leases. This is just a continuation of the Biden blame game. So if you want to explore for energy in America, the lease is just the first step, the first of many. You need to apply for permit to drill. In Wyoming, people know all about this. They call it APDs, the application for the permission to drill. You have to pay to apply after you paid the rent on the lease. So you apply, somebody has to make a decision. Those decisions used to be made at the local level. Not anymore. Now the Biden administration said, we know better than any of you people out around the country. We'll make all the decisions out of Washington, and the decision they made is they're not going to give any of these permits to drill. That's why the president can say, well, they're not drilling. Well, you're not letting people drill. Now, we're not talking about a couple leases. We're talking about thousands and thousands, over 4,000 leases tied up that way. We have another group of leases that are tied up by environmental activists who love to sue to stop energy exploration. They want to keep it in the ground. So companies are paying their rental fees. They want to explore for energy. They're being blocked by the administration, and then they're being blamed by that same administration for not exploring for energy. The president says, well, use it or lose it. Well, that's the law of the land right now. If it doesn't produce oil or gas within 10 years, you actually lose the permit. He doesn't want to explain that to folks. Now, if the lease does produce energy, does produce oil, then the government actually reaps the benefit from that. They get tax money from that. That helps pay for many of the things that we do as a government. In Wyoming, in our state areas, we use it to help with the paying for education, pay for health care, vital services in the community paid for by the successful exploration and recovery of energy that is currently underground, that Joe Biden wants to keep underground. Now in the president's budget, he wants to charge an additional fee on top of all of this. So he refuses to let them drill. He wants to charge them for not drilling. This is something out of Alice in Wonderland. More fees will mean produce less. We need to produce more. That's a way to get down the price at the pump, produce more American energy. Democrats refuse to admit that the percentage of leases that are actually being used today has never been higher. These are old leases. Democrats' excuses on this issue are what I would put in the category of the big lie. The big lie to support an anti-American energy agenda. It's an agenda of less American energy, more taxes, higher prices. It's the reason why millions of American families today are struggling to get by. They're feeling the pain. According to one estimate from the economist at Bloomberg, American families will spend an extra $5,200 this year. That's $100 a week compared to last year to just stay even. It's all due to inflation, the cost of groceries, the cost of gas, the cost of goods. All of those things are squeezing the American families. People are being crushed. Their dreams are being crushed. Potential savings to send kids to college, that's going away. Savings for a vacation, that's going away. You got to empty your wallet to fill your tank under Joe Biden's energy policies. And the extra $100 a week, this is on top of last year's inflation, where people across the country said they were paying more and more to get less and less, and even if they got a raise, they couldn't keep up. Kept falling further and further behind. People across the country are already living paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford more price increases. They need real solutions, and they are not getting them from this White House. The answer seems pretty simple. Stop the reckless spending here in Washington. Unleash American energy. So President Biden needs to do a couple of things right away to unleash American energy. First is a long-term commitment to produce more American energy. Energy companies aren't going to invest if they think Joe Biden is going to shut them down tomorrow. And he said that's what his goal is in a recent speech. He wants them to produce more today so he can shut them down tomorrow. He does need to open up our federal lands. We should auction off leases right away. And Joe Biden should approve those 4,600 drilling permits, which today are still stuck in limbo. He put them there, locked them in. It takes months to get production up and running. Got to get the right permits, got to have the pipelines. Need to speed up the process for pipelines as well. Although we did see the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all of the commissioners come to the Energy Committee, and they don't seem to be very interested, at least the ones in the majority don't seem very interested in speeding up the pipeline process or allowing pipelines at all. And finally, Joe Biden needs to stop attacking the hardworking men and women of this country who continue to produce energy, who go to work every day to keep the lights on, to keep us warm in winter. We need these workers out there, and Joe Biden needs to stop attacking them on a daily basis. They're the ones who can get us out of the crisis. They're the ones we need for the economic recovery. Instead of spending our savings, it is time to unleash American energy. Madam President, we need more American energy, and we need it now. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll. Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
Majority Leader?
are we in a quorum?
We are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask that the Senate resume legislative session and vote the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to H.R. 4373 under the previous order.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 310, H.R. 4373, an act making appropriations for the Department of State, foreign operations, and related programs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2022, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is that the sense of the Senate the debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 4373, an act making appropriations for the Department of State, foreign operations, and related programs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2022, and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory in the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Booker, Duckworth, Heinrich, Reed, Rosen, Schumer, Sinema, Stabenow, Tester, and Warren. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Crapo, Johnson, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, McConnell, Romney, Scott of Florida, and Tillis. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Sass, No. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. No. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. No. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey. Aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley. No. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. No. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn. No. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. No. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. No. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane. Aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Rounds, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Hassan, Aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Yeah, for the purposes of reconsideration, I change my vote to no.
Mr. Schumer, no.
Yep.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 52. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I enter a motion to reconsider.
Motion is entered.
And Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to resume executive session.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, I want there to be no mistake about what just happened here on the Senate floor. Republicans blocked a bipartisan bill that would provide vaccines, testing, and therapeutics for the American people. Yesterday, a group of Democrats and Republicans announced we had reached a bipartisan agreement for COVID relief funding. But today, a majority of Senate Republicans have blocked this critical and much-needed funding from going forward. Vaccines, therapeutics, and testing were negotiated in good faith, and they should not be held hostage to extraneous, unrelated issues. This is too important for the health of the American people. But that seems precisely what some Republicans want to do. This is a potentially devastating vote for every single American who is worried about the possibility of a new variant rearing its nasty head within a few months. It is devastating for any American who in the future looks for a vaccine or a booster shot, only to be told supplies have run out. It is devastating for anyone looking down the line to get tested because they feel sick or want their family safe and discover no tests are available. It is devastating for anyone who, God forbid, falls seriously ill, but can't access life-saving therapeutics because the federal government can't purchase new supplies because of the vote our colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle just took. Too many Republicans seem to want to play politics at a time when we need to work together to pass legislation our country desperately needs. Republicans voted no on vaccines for kids. Republicans voted no on tests for new COVID variants. Republicans voted no on therapies to save lives and make us less sick. Have we learned nothing from the last 2 years of living with this horrible disease? Have Republicans learned nothing about how lack of preparation could damage our economy? This money, the money that they rejected today, will go a long way to keeping our schools, our businesses, our churches, our communities running as normally as possible. If we want to stay at normal, we need these dollars. Without these dollars, the risk of schools closing, of businesses closing, of public transportation closing is too large. Should a future variant rear its nasty head, Americans will know who voted against more funding. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This was a $10 billion agreement that was fully paid for. If there's another surge, it cost us 10 times that if we're behind the curve again. I hope Republicans will get serious about this. It should not be so difficult for them to do something so good and important for our country. There's still some time. I hope my Republican colleagues change their tune quickly. I yield the floor.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the opportunity to address the Senate on an issue of real importance to our country and to families in Colorado and all across the United States. Today, 120 economists wrote an open letter in the face of the inflation that we're now facing as a nation as a result of the economic growth that we are having coming out of this very deep recession and the supply chain interruptions that have caused inflation. 120 economists sent an open letter saying that, quote, the expanded child tax credit is one of the easiest, most effective, and direct tools currently at our disposal to help families deal with the impact of inflation on family budgets. The expert opinions about the causes of and solutions to rising inflation are as varied as the authors of this letter, they wrote. But we agree on this. We agree on this. The expanded child tax credit is too small to meaningfully increase inflation across the whole economy. That means that the $100 billion a year that the child tax credit costs to lift half the kids out of poverty isn't going to drive inflation in a $21 trillion economy. That's one of the points these economists agreed on. But they wrote, it will make an important difference for family budgets, especially families in the bottom half of the income spectrum. Monthly child tax credit payments are a proven success at helping families keep up with the everyday costs of keeping a family afloat. Mr. President, I'd ask to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. This is no surprise to me. I was for the child tax credit before we had COVID because for the last 50 years, as I've said before on this floor, we had an economy that has worked really well for the top 10% of Americans and basically hasn't worked for anybody else. We have some of the lowest economic mobility in the industrialized world. We've got some of the greatest income inequality in the industrialized world. Stunningly, in the last two economic downturns, economic inequality has only gotten staggeringly worse in this country because of the massive asset inflation that's benefited the wealthiest people in the economy who are in a position to make money on their money, or in the case of a lot of people on real estate in Colorado, that's making it harder and harder and harder for working people to find a place to live. And I can tell you, Mr. President, that our kids pay the highest price from this. I was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools before I was in this job. Majority of kids were kids of color. Majority of kids were kids living in poverty, and their families were working, contrary to what some people around here think, their families were working 2 and 3 jobs. The problem wasn't that their families weren't working. It wasn't that they weren't working hard. They were killing themselves. And no matter what they did, they couldn't get their kids out of poverty. And that's not a consequence of anything that is their fault. They're doing everything they can. For that matter, their kids are doing everything they can. Going to schools that ought to do a better job for them, kids living in poverty all over this country. And some people think that we have to just accept this as a fundamental aspect of our economy or our democracy or our society, that somehow the United States of America is such a failure as a community that we have to accept being 38th out of 41 industrialized countries in terms of childhood poverty, that we're willing to permanently accept the idea that the poorest people in our society are our children. I think there's something we can do about it. I know there's something we can do about it. I know there's a lot of skepticism about the federal government's ability to do anything well. Mr. President, I share that skepticism sometimes. We fought 2 wars in the Middle East that lasted for 20 years, that cost about $5.6 trillion. Seems like a set of bad decisions. We have cut taxes on the floor of this body by $8 trillion since 2001. Almost all of the benefit of that has gone to the wealthiest people in the country. when we've got the worst income inequality that we've had since 1928. It's been staggering to watch. It's been staggering to watch people stay here at the end of a legislative year, at the end of a Congress, and burn the midnight oil to make sure that we can extend the tax cuts for the wealthiest people in the country and for the largest corporations in America. That's how you know it's 2 o'clock in the morning in the United States Senate. It's when we have to extend tax cuts for the richest people in this country during a time of devastating income inequality that's perpetuated by the economic cycles that we continue to have. But last year, Mr. President, as you know, because you were a big part of this, we did something different. We adopted the expanded child tax credit. We adopted the expanded earned income tax credit. Those bills were Bennett Brown and Brown Bennett, respectively. My friend Sherrod Brown from the great state of Ohio. And here on this ahead of tax day, I wanted to come down to the floor just to give you a little report. Kind of a book report, a status report on what has happened. And, Mr. President, what I want to tell you is it worked. It worked. It worked. We discovered we didn't have to live in a society that was 38th out of 41 industrialized countries. We discovered that we didn't have to accept a world where the poorest people in our country were our children. We benefited 61 million kids in the United States. 90% of the children in Connecticut, 90% of the children in Colorado, and 90% of the children all across this country directly benefited from a bill we passed here. We cut childhood poverty nearly in half. We cut hunger by a quarter for families with kids during a pandemic, which feels like a worthy thing to have done. We did it without adding a single bureaucrat to the federal government. We did it without adding one more federal agency. We proved we could do it. And then we didn't extend it at the end of the year. And now, predictably, childhood poverty is shooting up in the United States of America. Hunger is shooting up in the United States of America. I was on the phone, Mr. President, with the leaders of the food banks across Colorado who have done such an incredible job during this recession and during the last recession, making sure people are fed. I've visited some of those food banks. I know that people are saying that to me that there are, 2/3 of the people that are showing up were people that didn't show up before we had this catastrophe of COVID. But guess what's getting longer now as a result of our failure to extend the child tax credit? It's the lines in these food banks. It's the people coming to get food for their kids instead of being able to go to the grocery store with the dignity of the expanded child tax credit. There is a shred of good news here that I wanted to just speak about for a second, because this will be my chance to do it. And I just want to remind people that as families file their tax returns, they'll receive the second half of their child tax credit, which is worth up to $1,800 per child. That's still available. It's not coming in a monthly form anymore. It's not coming into your bank account anymore in that automatic way. But when you file your tax returns, you will receive it. And the other thing, because of the EITC work that we did, the Earned Income Tax Credit work, workers without children will receive the expanded EITC, which we tripled last year. We finally decided we're not going to tax people into poverty anymore in this country, which is what we were doing before we expanded that. So I wanted to remind families to claim their child and dependent care tax credit as well. We expanded that last year to a maximum of $4,000 per child. And in my view, Mr. President, we have to continue to come down here and fight to make these credits permanent. And it's my goal for us to end childhood poverty in this country. I think cutting it in half, that was an exciting thing. It's been a long time around here, decades, generations, since we've seen a reduction of poverty in this country like the reduction in childhood poverty we saw last year. Generations since we've seen a reduction in hunger like we saw last year. And the good news is we now know that it's a fact that we can do it. There are a lot of countries in the world that have an expanded child tax credit or child benefit like the child tax credit, and in all those countries, fewer of their kids live in poverty. And their workforce participation rates are actually higher, which doesn't surprise me at all based on the stories I heard from families about what they were spending the child tax credit on, which was everything that had to do with their kids. From buying back-to-school clothes to paying for a bicycle so a young man in Colorado Springs could stay at school late so he could have extracurriculars that he otherwise wouldn't have had the ability to achieve, so that his mom could stay at work for a few more hours so she could provide for the family. There is literally no data in America or anywhere else that doesn't support the idea that this is a pro-work policy, the child tax credit. We didn't have any trouble, as I said earlier, extending the $8 trillion of tax cuts that we have cut for the wealthiest people in this country since 2001. For that money, we could have extended the child tax credit for 50 years. We could have doubled it for 25 years, and we could have ended childhood poverty in the United States of America. I guarantee you that would have been a better investment than sending money to people that need it least in our economy. I'd say to my own party that I'm really grateful that we passed this last year, but I'm deeply, deeply disappointed that we couldn't come together and extend it. I am deeply, deeply disappointed that we haven't fulfilled our promise to reverse the Trump tax cuts for the richest people in America. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely upside down. But that's where we find ourselves. I wish I could express how different it felt at the end of the year when it was kids, many of whom living in poverty, and their families who were getting, on average, $450 a month, when the lights were going out on them, and we just went home. We just went home. There was nobody burning the midnight oil here to make sure that the kids got the benefit of this. And by the way, even if you don't believe that living in a society where the poorest people are your kids, and that it ought to be a purpose of a nation to lift kids who through no fault of their own find themselves in poverty, who through no fault of their own find themselves living in a country where we have less economic mobility than almost any other industrialized country in the world, and therefore don't have the opportunity to rise that generations had before them, and hopefully generations that'll come after them, and that are attending a system of education in this country because of the lack of early childhood education in the United States, because of the lack of quality of K-12 education in this country, because of the incredible expense of higher education, who are attending a system that's actually reinforcing the income inequality we have rather than liberating people from their circumstances. The best predictor of the quality of your education in this country is your parents' income, to the point of ruthlessness. To the point of ruthlessness. I want to mention that Senator Romney, who's a Republican from Utah, has a very similar bill to my bill to expand the child tax credit. In fact, it's basically the same bill. He's a little more generous with kids under the age of 6. And we've got a difference of view on pay-fors, but I think that's a bridgeable difference. And I have no doubt that in the long term, we will come to a bipartisan agreement in this chamber to make the enhanced child tax credit permanent, to decide that even if you don't care about the kids, which you should, that the country can't afford this level of childhood poverty, that our democracy won't be sustained with this level of income inequality. That's what I believe. That's what I know. Childhood poverty costs the United States of America $1 trillion a year. That's why it's not surprising that Columbia University did a study and found that we get an 8x return, that the child tax credit would pay back to the United States 8 times what it cost. Again, what it costs is $100 billion a year. Childhood poverty costs us $1 trillion a year. And instead of just accepting the idea that we're going to be at the bottom of the cellar when it comes to kids living in poverty, what we said was, no, we're going to cut it in half. And let me assure you, as a former school superintendent the costs of mitigating for childhood poverty far exceed the costs of diminishing. And it's an amazing thing to me, on top of everything else that we're talking about today, that when families are in the grip of the kind of inflation they're in the grip of, which is costing them somewhere between $270 and $300 a month, depending on where they live, depending on who they are, that it wouldn't occur to us that the easiest thing to do would be just to reinstate what we were doing last year and allow people to have the benefit of $450 on average to raise their children, to pay for a little bit of extra child care, to pay for a little bit of extra transportation, to fix a car that's broken so they can stay on the job. I know there's some colleagues here who think that this policy disincentivizes work. Mr. President, even before we passed this last year, every study that looked at this that I was aware of, with the exception of one outlier that I think had terrible data, every single one said that this wasn't going to negatively affect work. And guess what? Now we've had a 6-month experiment in the United States of America, and every study, including one by the American Enterprise Institute, which was a doubter about this policy, and I think probably still is a doubter about this policy, found that it had no effect on people's work habits. The problem in America is not that people don't work hard. That is not the problem that we have in this country. People are killing themselves. And it is true that wages are up about 5.6% since the Biden administration went into office, which is great, awesome. That's great. But we've had the effects of inflation, and we're a long way from having an economy that when it grows for everybody, which, by the way, that is what we need to do. That's what we have to achieve. This democracy will not survive another 50 years of an economy that when it grows for the top 10%, and everyone else's wages are flat, or everyone else is effectively in a recession. There's no evidence in world history that that level of income inequality, that lack of economic mobility, that over 100 years you can sustain a democracy. And we don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. We could make it permanent, put it back in place, pay for it, by the way. I believe we should pay for it by raising taxes on the wealthiest people in the country, like we said we were going to do, by reversing the Trump tax cuts, the Trump giveaways, which were sold as a middle-class tax cut. They were so smart because they gave people in the lower levels of the income ladder a little bit to say, there's your Trump tax cut. So he could go out to the Mahoning Valley, go out to Youngstown, tell people, you got your tax cut, you're welcome. What he didn't tell them was 52% of the Trump tax cut went to the top 5% of Americans. That after he left the people in the Mahoning Valley, Youngstown, old steel town, and then he went on to Mar-a-Lago where the people were all having New Year's Eve dinner or whatever it was they were having, and the first thing he said to them was, you're welcome. That was a lot closer to the truth. You're welcome. You are welcome. That I cut your taxes at a time when income inequality is greater than any time since 1929. You're welcome. That I cut the corporate rate to 21%, even though no one in corporate America was asking for a 21% tax cut. You're welcome, is what he said. I said earlier, Mr. President, before you were here, that there are people in the country that are skeptical of the federal government doing anything well, and that I have my own skepticism for the reasons that I said earlier. And there were people in terms of the child tax credit who said it would never work. You know, 6 months before we did it, 4 months before we did it, I was getting stopped in the hallway by reporters every day. Do you think they're really going to be able to do this? Can the IRS and the Department of Treasury, can they really administer this? And the answer is yes, they did. They did a fantastic job. They didn't get everybody at first. And we knew that would be a problem. We enlisted people all over the state of Colorado that work with folks, that work with working families and work with families that are living in poverty. Because remember, this wasn't just about kids living in poverty. 90% of America's children benefited from this. That's why some people have called this Social Security for kids. Some people have called it universal basic income for kids. I think it's a good thing because I can tell you 90% of the kids in Colorado can use the help. Because 90% of the people in this country and in my state have not benefited from economic growth the same way the top 10% of Americans have for the last 50 years. And as I mentioned, I just want to say again on this floor, because there are people out here saying people are going to drop out of the workforce. It did not happen. It didn't happen in other countries that have a tax benefit like this for kids. And it didn't happen during the 6 months that we were here. I understand maybe we'd have a different debate. Maybe people say, oh my God, Michael, all these people dropped out of the workforce. It didn't work the way you said it would. It did work the way that I said it would. It did work the way the data said that it would. And moms and dads, very unsurprisingly to me, who were working hard to begin with, probably just worked harder. Because now they had the chance to pay for a little extra child care. Now they had the chance to fix a car, or, as I said, let their kid go to extracurricular activities so they could stay at work. And that's what all the studies have shown. So I suppose one good thing has come out of this, which is, or maybe it's more than one good thing, it's that we now know that America is no different than any other place in this respect. And when parents get a marginal, an incremental amount of money, that they don't quit their jobs, they feed their kids. But as a society, we're able to say we cut childhood poverty in half, we cut hunger in half by 25%. What good is it, Mr. President, that now there are families that are lined up in soup kitchens today that weren't there 6 months ago because they had the benefit of the child tax credit. As I said, parents spent this credit on all kinds of different things. I mentioned child care, I mentioned a bicycle for extracurriculars, but I'll tell you the thing that I heard from every single parent that I talked to, and there was a lot of them in Colorado over the last 6 months, the last 6 months of last year, was the stress that it had relieved their families. That grinding stress of being in a recession, that the grinding stress of being in the middle of a pandemic, the grinding stress of having your kids out of school or having interrupted schooling, the grinding stress of living in an economy where people are saying to you, no matter how hard you work, that somehow it's your fault that you can't get your family ahead. And that the decisions that we've made over many years in this chamber and in the chamber across there, and that some of the largest institutions have made as well, unfortunately has created real headwinds for working people and for their families. We're in the middle here of considering the China Competes bill, which I think, Mr. President, gives us a real opportunity to reassess what we've been doing for the last 40 or 50 years. Every single thing we said and we told the American people we were doing in their name with respect to China and its presence in the World Trade Organization and what China would do as a result of that, none of that turned out to be true. When I say China, I don't mean the Chinese people, I mean Beijing. And we realize now that they weren't going to follow the rules of the road. We realize now that they were engaged in state-sponsored capitalism that's very hard to compete with. And that instead of just privileging the people in our society that want to make stuff as cheaply as possible in China, maybe we ought to be thinking about other things like our supply chain, protecting our supply chain, or our national security, or whether we're creating good-paying jobs here in the United States so that when the economy grows, it grows for everybody. We have an opportunity to do that now, and that's what I want, Mr. President. That's what I really want, is an economy that when it grows for everybody. Because that's the American dream. That's the story we've told ourselves about who we are as a people, and that's the way to strengthen our democracy. That's what I really want. In the meantime, what I would like us to do, since we now know how to do it, finally, is lift half the kids in this country out of poverty so they have a chance to pursue the American dream themselves. I used to say that this chamber treated America's children like they were someone else's children because of the education system that we've provided for them. And when we did the child tax credit, I came out here and I said, I can finally come to this floor and say, we are now treating America's children like they are America's children. But for the moment, that's no longer true. And for the moment, we're treating them like they're someone else's children, and we will rue the day that we did that. We will rue the day that we did that. This is a pro-work policy. It's a pro-family policy. It is a pro-democracy policy. And we now know it worked. And it worked well. And we got to fight to make it permanent. And that's what I'll do. Mr. President, with that, I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
are we in a quorum call?
No, we are not.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, Europe has seen its share of horror over the last century. The atrocities of World War I, World War II, the Bosnian War, and Ukrainians in particular suffered under the rule of Joseph Stalin. During the tragedy known as Holodomor, millions of Ukrainians died from starvation, forced starvation. In the wake of some, if not all, of these atrocities, the world responded by bringing the perpetrators to justice. After World War II, of course, there were the Nuremberg trials. And after the Bosnian War, President Milosevic was charged with crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Tribunal. Sadly, now, in 2022, we are faced with the question, how will the world react to the crimes that are now being committed in Ukraine? Over the past week, we have witnessed the reality of Vladimir Putin's genocidal rampage on the innocent people of Ukraine. And the scenes of brutality in Bucha are seared in our collective memory. Today in Bucha, Ukraine, there are mass graves surrounded by bodies hastily shoved into garbage bags, civilian cars crushed like tin cans, front yards and gardens lined with the dead bodies of innocent Ukrainian people. One survivor, Antonina Pomashko, age 76, watched helplessly as Russian soldiers murdered her daughter, Tetsiana. Without provocation, the Russian soldiers opened fire on her home, and the bullets ripped through the gates and fence as Tetsiana was standing in the yard. She was killed in an instant. Yesterday, the New York Times ran a photo of Mrs. Pomashko looking over her daughter's dead body. Mrs. Pomashko had covered it with plastic sheets and wooden boards. It was lying in the same spot where she was killed last month. In the words of Mrs. Pomashko, there was so much shelling, I did not know what to do. There is nothing that will fill the void of loss and despair that Mrs. Pomashko and millions of Ukrainians feel at this very moment. But there is more and much, much more that we as Americans must do. The actions of Vladimir Putin harken back to some of Europe's darkest days, the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II, the massacres in former Yugoslavia, days that we must endure and days which we hope we never have to relive. And as I mentioned, after the Allied forces liberated Europe in 1945, the world responded. It came together at the historic Nuremberg trials. When the trials first convened at the Palace of Justice on November 21st, 1945, Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson delivered the opening statement, and he said, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, so devastating, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." Civilization cannot tolerate and cannot survive the war crimes we've witnessed in Ukraine going unpunished. President Biden recognized that fact on Monday in calling for a war crime trial for the horrors in Ukraine. President Lincoln once said to Congress when he proposed an end to slavery, "We, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility." It is within the power and responsibility of this body to deny safe haven in America or anywhere to perpetrators of these heinous crimes. Under existing law, foreign war criminals who come to the United States, incredibly, cannot be prosecuted. They cannot be held liable in civil action or even deported for their heinous crimes. Currently, the War Crimes Act only applies if the perpetrator or victim is a U.S. service member or a U.S. national. In other words, it would not cover Russian officials,
Were they responsible for the commission of war crimes in Ukraine or Russian soldiers who committed those crimes? We also don't have a statute or law in America making crimes against humanity a violation of U.S. law. This was the primary offense prosecuted at Nuremberg, and it is a critical tool for holding violators accountable. Other grave human rights violations, including genocide and torture, are already crimes under U.S. law that cover any offender found in the United States. This should also be true for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that is why I will introduce the War Crimes Accountability Act. The War Crimes Accountability Act would ensure the United States has the tools to hold accountable the perpetrators of war crimes and other atrocities. The bill expands the War Crimes Act to cover all war criminals who are in the United States, regardless of where they're from, and it fills the gap in our criminal code for prosecuting crimes against humanity so that we can hold perpetrators who come to this country accountable. This is not just a hypothetical idea. Consider one example. After the massacre of thousands of innocent men and boys in Srebrenica massacre, a war criminal named Marko Baskic made his way to the United States. When law enforcement tracked him down, they could only charge him with a visa fraud, not a war crime or crimes against humanity. We must bring war criminals to justice for their horrific crimes, not slap them on the wrist with a visa technicality. The United States must never again provide safe haven for perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Our nation led the first prosecutions for crimes in the Nuremberg trials. It's time for the United States to lead again. Ultimately, the day will come when Vladimir Putin faces justice, and his name and his regime will be remembered in history alongside the worst of the worst. And until Putin and his sycophants are brought to justice, we cannot waver, we cannot equivocate in providing Ukraine with all the resources, weapons, and aid they need to triumph over Russia. Quite simply, the United States of America should never be a safe haven for a war criminal. The United States of America should be holding war criminals responsible for their horrible conduct and what they've done to the poor and innocent people in other places. And they should be held liable on a criminal and civil basis. That's what this bill would do. It's an effort to move forward with the cause of justice, but I hope it's only the beginning. When nations around the world adopt similar laws to the ones which I'm proposing, we will make it clear that there are no safe havens left for war criminals. They will pay a price wherever they end up, and that is the way it should be if there is going to be justice. Slava Ukraini. I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Today, Senator Johnson and I will present our third speech on the Biden investigation series. Today, we will focus on James Biden, the president's brother. Hunter Biden wasn't the only Biden family member who had connections to the Chinese Communist regime. James Biden did as well. Before we begin our discussion, I think we need to mention the main company once again, the Chinese company that goes by the initials CEFC. In the first two speeches, Senator Johnson and I established the connection between CEFC and the Communist Chinese government. We established the connection between CEFC and Hudson West 3. We then established the connection with Hunter Biden's Owasco, Hudson West 3, and CEFC. We showed that Hunter Biden and James Biden actively assisted CEFC as it worked to expand its footprint and its holdings in the global and U.S. energy sector. And today, we'll add James Biden's Lion Hall Group to the list of Biden family companies connected to the communist regime. In my and Senator Johnson's September 23rd, 2020 report, we showed that Hunter Biden and James Biden and their aligned firms received approximately $4.8 million from Hudson West 3 from August 2017 to September 2018. During that same time frame, Hunter Biden's Owasco sent 20 or so wires to James Biden's Lion Hall Group. Those 20 wires totaled just about $1.4 million. The liberal media and our Democrat colleagues originally tried to claim that Johnson and my findings were Russian disinformation. Last week, the Washington Post reported the following, quote, over the course of 14 months, the Chinese energy conglomerate, here parenthetically they're referring to CEFC, and its executives paid $4.8 million to entities controlled by Hunter Biden and his uncle, according to government records, court documents, and newly disclosed bank statements, as well as emails contained on a copy of a laptop hard drive that purportedly once belonged to Hunter Biden, end of quote. The Post also reported this, so I start to quote. During that time period, about $1.4 million was transferred from Hunter's account to the Lion Hall Group, the consulting firm that James Biden ran, according to other government records reviewed by the Post. End of Washington Post quote. Senator Johnson and I were right 2 years ago. We knew it then, but it's been a long road to defend our work product. The liberal media and our Democratic colleagues aggressively tried to make the case that we were peddling Russian disinformation. Now, what will the liberal media and my Democrat colleagues say now in light of last week's Washington Post article that substantiated the work that Senator Johnson and I have been doing? We still haven't received any apology from our Democratic colleagues for their false claims against us these past several years. They haven't apologized to the American people, and I'm not going to hold my breath. When will the big-time media in Washington awaken to respect my reputation for the thorough investigative and oversight work that I do as a senator? And it's also my constitutional responsibility to do exactly that. Now, we have more records to discuss today. Today, Senator Johnson and I will show you financial transfers direct from Hudson West 3 to the Lyon Hall Group. In other words, in these transfers, Hunter Biden's Owasco isn't the middleman. So let's look at the first poster here. This is a January 2018 bank statement from Hudson West 3. Now, there's a lot going on here, so I'll just mention several items. First, we've got two examples of more wire transfers from Hudson West 3 for $165,000. The underlying wire data, which Senator Johnson and I will make public this very day, shows that money went to Hunter Biden's Owasco. That money was for the August 2017 LLC agreement, which, by its terms, saw James Biden become a manager of Hudson West 3. That agreement sent $100,000 to Hunter Biden, $65,000 to James Biden every month. Actions occurred after the $5 million wire from Northern International Capital to Hudson West 3 on August 2017. Northern International was connected to Yi Jinping, who was connected to CEFC. As Senator Johnson and I have established, that company is an arm of the Communist Chinese regime. This new record shows how closely connected Hudson West 3 was with CEFC, while Hunter Biden and James Biden received money from Hudson West 3. Third, we've got a January 17, 2018 wire to Lyon Hall Group. Now, that happens to be James Biden's company. James Biden received $18,000 from Hudson West 3. The same month, that company sent money to CEFC. Now, this is just one example of many. Accordingly, the official bank record makes clear the financial connections between and among James Biden and the Communist Chinese elements. To the liberal media and my Democratic colleagues, is this the official bank record Is that Russian disinformation, as you accused us of spreading? Now let's go to the second poster. This is Hudson West 3 bank record from April 2018. Here you see wire transfers from Coal Harbor Capital. That company was connected to Merwin Yang, who was an associate of Yi Jingming and Gong Wen Dong. Now, as Senator Johnson, as I have already established, all of them are connected to the communist regime. These are the players in the game that I mentioned in the first speech last Monday. And now we've established they appear repeatedly in bank records with high dollar transfers. These transfers aren't by accident. No way. There's clearly a scheme here. There's a plan among and between all these individuals and their respective companies, which then begs the question, has the Justice Department acquired these records? If so, what has the Justice Department done about these records? Now, moving to the next transaction, there's another $165,000 wire. Again, that relates back to the LLC agreement that connected Hunter and James Biden to the Chinese firm CEFC and its projects in the energy sector. Then you have a $34,000 wire to James Biden's Lion Hall Group from Hudson West 3. So what was this all about? Let's take a look then at the third poster. Now look at the sixth line from the bottom. I want to quote. It says, office expense and reimbursement. That's the same reason given for the first poster that I showed you. We'll make all of these records public again this very day. For those of you who may still doubt my and Senator Johnson's oversight work, I'm going to present one last transaction to bring all of this home. So look at the fourth poster. In my and Senator Johnson's September 2020 report, we found that James Biden and Hunter Biden went on a $99,000 global spending spree, courtesy of who? Another Chinese person that I've mentioned so many times in these three speeches, Gong Wen Dong. The spending spree included airline tickets, purchases at Apple stores, hotels, and restaurants. This bank record next to me shows a $99,000 transaction in September 2013 or 2017. But that's not all that we have. Let's turn to the final poster. This is number 5. This is a credit card authorization form for $99,000. So look at the bottom. There's the signature block with Hunter Biden and Gong Wen Dong. Now, to the liberal press and my Democratic colleagues, are these official records Russian disinformation? So what's the point of all these records? Not only have Senator Johnson and I illustrated through new records that Hunter Biden was financially connected to the communist regime, these records show James Biden was as well. These new records show direct financial links between companies connected to the communist regime and James Biden through Lion Hall Group. These new records support the findings in our report to the last Congress. Remember, those reports were put out in September and November of 2020. And everybody was saying it was Russian disinformation. Forget the facts. Forget the evidence. Forget the investigative journalism. The liberal media wanted to provide cover for then candidate Joe Biden. They did whatever they could to smear our investigations. With these new records, there can be no doubt that James Biden was financially connected to the corporations and individuals with extensive link to communist China, and that he and Hunter Biden were in it together, working to help a Chinese government-linked energy company pursue deals and expand its reach in the energy sector. Now it's Senator Johnson's turn.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. What Senator Grassley and I have shown over the course of 6 speeches are the actual bank records of financial transactions tying President Biden's son, Hunter, and his brother, James, to businesses that are essentially the arms of the communist Chinese regime. But the Biden business ventures include activities in many more countries than just China. In our September and November 2020 reports, we showed a vast web of Biden family foreign financial entanglements that were largely ignored by the media and falsely labeled Russian disinformation by our Democrat colleagues. As outrageous as the suppression of our reports and the false attacks were, perhaps the most egregious behavior came from 51 former intelligence agency officials who lent their names and reputations to an effort designed to convince the American public that Hunter Biden's laptop had, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation, unquote. Without any evidence backing their assertion, they engaged in their own, quote, information operation, unquote, by signing a public letter right before the election. Their letter was actual disinformation, coming from what are supposed to be trusted former members of our U.S. intelligence agencies. They shall be ashamed and held accountable for spreading this disinformation. By signing that disinformation letter, they reinforced false claims that the records on the laptop were not legitimate. By casting doubt on evidence of the Biden's corrupt practices, these former intelligence officials interfered in the 2020 election to a far greater extent than Russia could have ever hoped to achieve. Their willing accomplices in the press amplified this disinformation letter, and by doing so were equally guilty of egregious election interference. In August 2020, I wrote a public letter detailing the history, purpose, and goals of my oversight investigations. In that letter, I laid out the timeline of Joe and Hunter Biden's involvement in Ukraine. The timeline is very revealing. It starts in February 2014. That was the month of the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. 2 months later, on April 16, 2014, then Vice President Biden met with his son's business partner, Devin Archer, who is now a convicted felon at the White House. I just want to pause and just let that sink in a little bit. Devin Archer is now a convicted felon He got a meeting in the White House with the Vice President of the United States. That's kind of a big deal. The press didn't ask many questions. 5 days after that meeting in the White House, April 21st, Joe Biden visited Ukraine, and the media described him as, quote, the public face of the administration's handling of Ukraine. The next day, on April 22nd, Devon Archer joined the board of Burisma. What a coincidence. On April 28th, 6 days later, British officials seized $23 million from the London bank accounts of Burisma's owner, Mykola Zlochevsky. Let that sink in a little bit. 6 days after Devon Archer joined the board of Burisma, a day after Vice President Biden visited Ukraine, which was 5 days after he met with Devon Archer in the White House, British officials seized $23 million from the corrupt owner of Burisma. On May 13th, 2014, 3 weeks later, Hunter Biden joined the board of Burisma. What a coincidence. Because of the findings in our reports and the excellent investigative journalism on the part of John Solomon, we also now know that Hunter was involved with Elena Baturina, the corrupt and now sanctioned wife of the former mayor of Moscow, during the exact same period of time. On February 14th, 2014, Baturina wired $3.5 million to Rosemont Seneca Thornton, an investment firm co-founded by Hunter Biden. Between April 4th and April 5th, 2014, again, the same month that Joe Biden met with Devon Archer in the White House, Devon became a member of the board of Burisma. Hunter Biden and Devon Archer sent emails about meeting with Baturina, potentially relating to a business deal in Chelsea, New York. On April 13, 2014, 9 days before Devon Archer joined the board of Burisma, Hunter Biden and Devon Archer discussed a potential deal involving Baturina. Archer wrote to Baturina, quote, confirmed green light to fund deposit, unquote. Archer continued, quote, just spent 2 hours on the phone with Kiev. I am confident at this point this is a good, if not life-changing deal if the Ukraine doesn't collapse in the meantime. It's quite interesting to see how much significant activity involving the Bidens and corrupt actors in Russia and Ukraine occurred within a 6-week period, only 2 months after the Ukrainian Revolutionary Dignity. It sure looks like they intended to cash in on the turmoil in Ukraine. In my August 2020 letter, I listed a number of questions about then Vice President Biden's interaction with Hunter Biden's business partner and other family members' foreign financial dealings. In making this letter public, my hope was that the press, the very uninquisitive press, would begin to ask then President's candidate Joe Biden these important and legitimate questions. It should come to no surprise that the corporate media was completely uninterested and failed to conduct any investigative journalism. Nearly 2 years after I wrote this public letter, the mainstream media has still not adequately pressed President Biden for answers to these very legitimate questions. For example, number one, why did Joe Biden meet with Devon Archer at the White House on April 16, 2014? What did they discuss? Did they discuss anything related to Ukraine, Hunter Biden, or Burisma? Number two, was Joe Biden aware that Devon Archer joined the board of Burisma 6 days after that meeting, 1 day after he visited Ukraine? Three, does Joe Biden believe Burisma and its owner are corrupt? Number four, when did Joe Biden first become aware that Hunter Biden also joined the board of Burisma? 5, when did Joe Biden first become aware of how much money Hunter Biden was being compensated by Burisma? Senator Grassley in my report showed it is close to $4 million. Number 6, what does Joe Biden know about Hunter or James Biden's dealings with China? Number 7, what does Joe Biden know about financial benefits his brother and sister-in-law have obtained because of their relationships to him? Investigative reporter John Solomon has added a few more questions to my list, including what? Number 1, what, if anything, did Joe Biden know about his son's dealings with Russian oligarch Alina Baturina? Number 2, in 2017, a series of memos referred to a Chinese business deal that involved Hunter Biden and included a 10% equity for the, quote, big guy, unquote. What did Joe Biden know about this specific deal and who was, quote, the big guy, unquote? Number 3, emails on Hunter Biden's laptop, now in the possession of the FBI, refer to shared accounts or bills between Joe Biden and Hunter. Did Hunter ever give Joe Biden any money, gift, or financial benefit from Hunter's business dealings? After a long overdue analysis, the New York Times and Washington Post have finally admitted that records from Hunter's laptop are authentic, which means, although they will never admit this, that Senator Grassley and I were right and they were wrong. It is interesting to read how limited and muted their mea culpas are. My guess is that they learned a lot from their coverage of Nixon's Watergate scandal cover-up. They learned that when you've been caught in a cover-up, and that is what has happened here, you try to limit the damage by telling a little bit of the truth. In the intelligence world, this strategy is called, quote, a limited hangout, unquote. The Watergate co-conspirators called it, quote, a modified limited hangout, unquote. Regardless of what you call it, what the New York Times and the Washington Post are doing is not telling the whole truth. I doubt they ever will. But just in case they decide to pursue the truth with a little bit more rigor, they can use the above list of relevant questions as a good starting point for what they should be asking President Biden. For our part, Senator Grassley and I will continue to ask tough questions, review more information and records, and transparently provide that information to the American public. We intend to pursue and uncover the truth. I will now turn the floor back over to Senator Grassley for his closing remarks.
Mr. President, I ask permission to put my closing remarks in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Baldwin.